Tonight, we drift back to a quiet September night in 1961, when Betty and Barney Hill set out on a simple drive home through the winding roads of New Hampshire's White Mountains. Overhead, the stars glittered in a deep, velvet sky, and one light seemed just a little too curious. The road was empty, the air cool and scented faintly of pine, and the steady hum of tires on asphalt promised nothing but a peaceful journey. Yet somewhere between the mountains and the coast, time itself seemed to slip away. Settle in, let your breathing slow, and imagine yourself on that dark, gentle highway. With each mile, let the world grow softer, the night deeper, and the story carry you quietly toward dreams. But this isn't just any bedtime story. What happened to Betty and Barney Hill that September night would become the most documented, analyzed, and debated encounter in UFO history. 2 hours of their lives simply vanished from existence, leaving behind torn clothing, broken watches that would never work again, and strange circular marks on their car that made compass needles spin wildly when held near them. Most disturbing of all, they carried fragments of impossible memories, clinical examinations in rooms filled with blinding light, beings with large wraparound eyes, and a star map showing the origin of visitors from somewhere among the distant stars. This wasn't the fantasy of attention seekers. The Hills were reluctant witnesses who reported their experience quietly to authorities and only revealed the full scope of what happened years later, under hypnosis sessions designed to heal trauma that was tearing their lives apart. Their case became the template for every alien abduction story that followed, introducing details so specific they continue to influence accounts today. After 6 decades of investigation, the evidence they left behind still defies conventional explanation. The question isn't whether something extraordinary happened on that lonely mountain highway. The physical evidence confirms that much. The question is what that something was, and whether their recovered memories represent the most documented case of human contact with non-human intelligence in modern history. So let the gentle rhythm of this story carry you back to that September night when 2 people's quiet drive home became one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. Chapter 1. The Perfect Storm of 1961. Let's begin by setting the stage for what was about to unfold, because timing, as they say, is everything. The year is 1961, and America finds itself caught in the grip of the Cold War. The Soviet Union has just put the first man in space, and the nation is looking up at the skies with a mixture of wonder and worry. But there's something else capturing the public imagination, something that's been growing since 1947, when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing strange, disc-shaped objects flying in formation over the Cascade Mountains. Flying saucers. The term has entered the American vocabulary, splashed across newspaper headlines and whispered about in coffee shops. The Air Force has been quietly investigating these reports through something called Project Blue Book, but most sightings are explained away as weather balloons, aircraft, or astronomical phenomena. Against this backdrop of Cold War tension and UFO curiosity, we meet our protagonists, Betty and Barney Hill. Betty, 41, works as a social worker, dedicated to helping others navigate life's challenges. She's curious by nature, the type of person who reads voraciously and asks probing questions. Barney, 39, is a World War II veteran who now works for the U.S. Postal Service. He's methodical, practical, and possesses the kind of steady reliability that comes from military service. But here's what makes their situation particularly complex in 1961. America. Betty is white, and Barney is black. Their interracial marriage exists in a time and place where such unions face not just social disapproval, but real danger. They've already experienced harassment and threats. The stress of simply being themselves in public adds an extra layer of tension to their daily lives. Now, imagine the weight they're carrying as they begin what should be a simple, restorative trip. They've decided to take a short vacation, a drive to Niagara Falls and Montreal, a chance to escape the pressures of their daily life and just be together, without judgment. The vacation goes beautifully. 3 peaceful days of tourist attractions, scenic views, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. They take photographs, collect souvenirs, and for a brief moment, they exist in that bubble that travelers know so well, where the outside world and its complications feel very far away. But all good things must come to an end, and by the evening of September 19th, they're loading their luggage into their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air for the drive home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, here's where their story takes its first mysterious turn, though they don't realize it yet. Barney suggests they drive through the night, taking the scenic route through the White Mountains rather than the more direct highway. It's a decision that will place them on one of the most isolated stretches of road in New England during the darkest hours before dawn. The route they choose, Route 3 through New Hampshire's White Mountains, is breathtakingly beautiful by day. Towering peaks, dense forests, and crystalline lakes create a landscape that looks almost untouched by time. But at night, especially in September when the tourist season is winding down, it becomes something else entirely. Mile after mile of winding mountain road with virtually no traffic, no lights except their headlights, and no help for dozens of miles in any direction. As they begin their journey home, settling into the comfortable rhythm of a long night drive, Betty and Barney Hill have no way of knowing that they're about to become the central figures in one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. They don't know that in just a few hours something will begin following their car along this lonely mountain highway. They don't know that their simple drive home will stretch far longer than it should, with 2 hours of their lives simply disappearing. And they certainly don't know that when they finally do arrive home, they'll carry physical evidence of an encounter so extraordinary that it will challenge everything we think we know about our place in the universe. But for now, in these last moments of their normal life, they're just a couple driving home from vacation, the radio playing softly, their headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Chapter 2. The Light That Followed. It begins so simply, so quietly, that at first it seems like nothing at all. Picture Betty and Barney settling into that familiar rhythm of a long night drive. They've been on the road for about an hour now, winding through the White Mountains as the landscape rolls by in their headlights. Pine forests, rocky outcroppings, the occasional glimpse of a darkened house nestled in the trees. The radio plays softly between them, and they're talking in the comfortable way that couples do on long drives, sharing observations about their trip, planning their return to work, discussing the simple logistics of normal life. Barney is focused on the road ahead, his hands steady on the steering wheel. Betty is relaxed in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing out at the star-filled sky above the mountains. And then, Betty notices something. It's just after 10:30 p.m. when she first spots it. A bright light, low in the sky, just above the tree line. At first glance, it looks like it could be anything. A particularly bright star, maybe Venus, or perhaps a distant aircraft. "Look at that," she says to Barney, pointing through the windshield. Barney glances up briefly, then back to the winding road. "Probably just a star," he murmurs, the way we all dismiss things that seem unusual at first glance. But Betty keeps watching, and as she watches, something about this light begins to bother her. It's not behaving like a star should behave. It's not staying in one place relative to the horizon. Instead, it seems to be moving. Not quickly, but with a deliberate, purposeful motion that doesn't match any aircraft she's ever seen. "Barney," she says, her voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than alarm. "That light, it's following us. Consider what it feels like to realize that something in the sky is keeping pace with your car, not racing ahead like a plane, not disappearing behind the mountains like a satellite, but staying with you, matching your speed, maintaining a consistent position relative to your movement along the highway." Barney pulls the car over at a scenic turnout. one of those small roadside areas where travelers can stop to admire the mountain views. The engine idles quietly as they both get out, stretching their legs and looking up at the night sky. The light is still there, clearer now, brighter, and definitely not a star. Betty retrieves a pair of binoculars from the car, something they'd brought along for sightseeing during their vacation. As she adjusts the focus and peers through the lenses, what she sees makes her breath catch in her throat. "Barney," she whispers, not lowering the binoculars. It's not a plane. Through the magnification, what appeared to be a simple light now reveals itself as something structured, something mechanical. She can make out what looks like windows or ports arranged in a row, and behind those windows, movement. The suggestion of figures, silhouettes, shapes that could be occupants. But here's the truly unsettling part. As Betty is watching this object through the binoculars, the object appears to be watching them back. It maintains its position, hovering silently above the tree line, as if observing their observation. Barney is a practical man, a veteran, a postal worker, someone accustomed to dealing with facts and procedures. He takes the binoculars from Betty, skeptical, ready to identify this mystery as something perfectly ordinary. But when he looks through those lenses, his certainty wavers. What he sees defies his categories for normal explanation. The object appears to be disc-shaped or oval, roughly the size of a commercial aircraft, but silent as a whisper. The row of windows or ports Betty described is clearly visible, and yes, there does appear to be movement behind them. Shapes that suggest occupants looking out at the two humans standing beside their car on this lonely mountain road. They stand there for several minutes, passing the binoculars back and forth, each hoping the other will provide a rational explanation. But rational explanations are becoming harder and harder to find. The object doesn't behave like any aircraft they know. It makes no sound, shows no standard navigation lights, and most unnervingly, it seems to be responding to their presence. When they move, it moves. When they stop, it stops. It maintains a consistent distance, as if whoever or whatever is controlling it is deliberately keeping them in sight. "We should go," Barney finally says, though his voice carries an uncertainty that Betty has rarely heard from her usually confident husband. They get back in the car, but as they pull onto the highway and continue their journey south, the object comes with them. It doesn't fly ahead or fall behind. It paces them, maintaining that same relative position in the sky, like a silent escort through the mountain darkness. Mile after mile, the light continues to follow their car. Sometimes it appears to descend closer to the road. Other times it rises higher above the tree line, but it never disappears entirely. Betty continues to monitor it through the binoculars whenever the road straightens out enough for her to look up safely. And then, as they approach the area near Indian Head, something changes. The object begins to descend. Not gradually, not hesitantly, but with a purposefulness that sends a chill down both their spines. It's coming closer, much closer, and now even without binoculars they can see its details with alarming clarity. This is the moment when their strange encounter transforms from curious to genuinely frightening. This is when Betty and Barney Hill realize that their quiet drive home has become something else entirely, something that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Because what happens next will challenge everything they thought they knew about the world around them. Chapter 3. The Eyes in the Windows. We've arrived at the moment that changes everything. The moment when Barney Hill makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The object has descended much closer now, hovering perhaps 100 feet above the highway near a place called Indian Head. Even without binoculars, they can see it clearly. A dark, disc-shaped craft with a row of illuminated windows stretching across its face like watching eyes. Barney brings the car to a stop once more, but this time something is different. This time, an inexplicable compulsion overcomes his natural caution. Despite Betty's growing alarm, despite every instinct telling him to drive away as fast as possible, Barney gets out of the car and begins walking toward the craft. Step by step, he moves across the empty highway, binoculars in hand, drawn by a force he can't understand or resist. The September air is cool against his face, absolutely still, as if the entire mountain landscape is holding its breath. Through the binoculars, he can see them now. Figures standing behind the windows, looking down at him with what appear to be large, dark eyes that seem to wrap around the sides of their heads. The beings are small in stature, wearing dark uniforms, and they seem to be operating some kind of controls or instruments. But it's the eyes that capture him. Those large, compelling eyes that seem to bore directly into his consciousness, communicating without words a simple, terrifying message. Do not resist. Barney would later describe this moment as the most frightening experience of his life. Standing alone on that empty highway, staring up at occupants of a craft that shouldn't exist, feeling his own will dissolve under the gaze of those wraparound eyes. And then, in a moment of pure terror, his survival instincts finally break through whatever force has been compelling him forward. He tears the binoculars away from his face, turns, and runs back toward the car, shouting words that Betty will never forget. "They're going to capture us!" He throws himself behind the wheel, starts the engine, and accelerates down the mountain highway as fast as the winding road will allow. But even as they flee, both Betty and Barney can hear something that makes their blood run cold. A series of rhythmic beeping or buzzing sounds that seem to be coming from the trunk of their car. Beep, beep, beep. The sounds follow them as they drive, as if something is tracking their movement, monitoring their escape. The rhythm is steady, mechanical, unlike anything either of them has ever heard before. And then, as suddenly as it began, the beeping stops. The night returns to normal silence. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifts. They drive for several more miles through the mountain darkness, their hearts still racing, checking constantly in the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. But here's where their story takes perhaps its most unsettling turn. As they continue driving south through the White Mountains, something strange begins to happen to their sense of time and place. The familiar landmarks they should be passing seem wrong somehow. The road feels different. And when they finally do recognize their surroundings again, they're much further south than they should be, much closer to home. It's as if they've been transported through the night, covering distance they don't remember traveling, experiencing time they can't account for. When they finally pull into their driveway in Portsmouth, the clock reads nearly 5 a.m., at least 2 hours later than their drive should have taken, even accounting for their stops to observe the strange object. 2 hours that have simply vanished from their lives, leaving nothing behind but a gnawing sense that something profound and impossible has occurred. Chapter 4. The Evidence Left Behind. The house is quiet as Betty and Barney finally walk through their front door in the early hours of September 20th. Their dog, usually excited to see them return from any trip, seems strangely subdued, almost fearful. It keeps its distance, watching them with a wariness they've never seen before. They're both exhausted, but it's more than the fatigue of a long night drive. There's a heaviness in their bodies, a disorientation that feels almost like emerging from a deep, drugged sleep. Neither of them speaks much as they begin to unpack their luggage, each lost in trying to process what they've experienced. But as they handle their belongings, the physical evidence of their extraordinary night begins to reveal itself. Betty's blue dress, the one she'd worn for the drive home, has several tears in the fabric that she doesn't remember happening. The tears seem deliberately placed, as if someone had cut small samples from the material. Even more puzzling, there's a pinkish powder residue on the dress that neither of them can identify. It has no scent, no obvious source, and it doesn't match anything they encountered during their vacation or their stops at various gas stations along the way. Barney's shoes are scuffed and worn in ways that suggest he walked much farther than just from the car to the house and back. The leather is scraped. The soles show unusual wear patterns, as if he'd been walking on unfamiliar surfaces for an extended period. Most unnervingly, both of their watches have stopped completely, not slowed down, not running fast or slow, but stopped entirely at different times during the night. These are reliable timepieces that have never given them trouble before, and now they refuse to work, no matter what they do to repair them. They will never function again. But perhaps the strangest discovery awaits them outside. When they examine their car in the morning light, they find a series of perfectly circular, shiny spots on the trunk, the same area where they'd heard those mysterious beeping sounds during their escape from the mountain encounter. The spots are about the size of a silver dollar polished to a mirror. Finish, and arranged in no pattern they can discern. When Barney fetches a compass from the house to examine the areas more closely, something remarkable happens. The needle spins wildly whenever it comes near these circular marks, as if the metal of the car has been somehow magnetized or altered at the molecular level. They stand in their driveway in the soft morning light, holding that spinning compass, and the reality of their situation begins to sink in. Something happened to them during those missing 2 hours, something that left physical traces on their bodies, their clothing, and their vehicle. Something that defied every assumption they held about what was possible in the world they thought they knew. The rational parts of their minds searched desperately for conventional explanations. Perhaps they dozed off while driving and dreamed the entire encounter. Perhaps they'd stopped somewhere and forgotten about it. Perhaps there was some ordinary reason for the tears, the powder, the scuffed shoes, the broken watches, the mysterious spots on their car. But as the days pass, and they replay the events over and over in their minds, conventional explanations become harder and harder to sustain. The memories, fragmented though they are, feel too real, too consistent, too detailed to be mere dreams or hallucinations. And there's something else troubling them, something they can't quite put into words. Both Betty and Barney have the persistent feeling that their memories of the night are incomplete, that something significant happened during those missing hours that their conscious minds are somehow unable to access. It's a feeling that will only grow stronger in the weeks to come, as they begin to experience nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent sense that their encounter on the mountain highway was only the beginning of something much more extraordinary than they initially realized. Chapter 5. The Dreams That Wouldn't Stop. In the days following their encounter, Betty and Barney Hill face a dilemma that anyone who's experienced something extraordinary will recognize. Do you tell people what happened, knowing they'll likely think you've lost your minds? Or do you keep silent, carrying the weight of an impossible experience entirely alone? At first, they choose silence. They go about their daily routines. Betty returning to her work as a social worker. Barney to his job at the Postal Service, trying to process what they've experienced while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But the weight of their shared secret, combined with the physical evidence that confronts them every time they look at their torn clothing or their magnetized car, makes silence increasingly difficult to maintain. Betty, being naturally curious and methodical, begins doing research. She visits the local library, checking out books on astronomy to see if what they witnessed could have been some kind of conventional aircraft or astronomical phenomenon. She studies star charts, reads about atmospheric conditions, searches for any rational explanation that might account for their experience. But nothing she discovers comes close to explaining what they saw. A structured craft that maneuvered intelligently, responded to their presence, and was clearly under some form of conscious control. More troubling still, both of them begin experiencing vivid, disturbing dreams. Betty's dreams are particularly intense and detailed, recurring night after night for nearly a week in early October. In these dreams, she finds herself being escorted from their car by small, gray-skinned beings with large, dark eyes. The dreams have a clinical quality. She's taken to a room filled with bright lights, where various examinations are performed on both her and Barney. The detail in these dreams is extraordinary. She can describe the texture of the being's skin, the layout of the examination rooms, even specific conversations with what appears to be a leader among the beings. Most remarkably, in these dreams, she's shown a star map, a three-dimensional display of stars connected by lines representing what the leader describes as trade routes and travel patterns between distant worlds. When Betty wakes from these dreams, she's compelled to draw what she remembers. Her sketches show a network of stars connected by thick and thin lines, with specific details about which stars represent regular travel routes and which are more sporadic destinations. At first, both Betty and Barney assume these dreams are simply their mind's way of processing the trauma of their highway encounter. But as the dreams continue and become more detailed, they begin to wonder if they're remembering something that actually happened during those missing 2 hours. The psychological pressure begins to take its toll. Both of them experience anxiety, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Their usually strong marriage shows signs of strain as they struggle to understand what happened to them and what it might mean for their lives going forward. Finally, after several weeks of internal debate, they decide they have to tell someone. But who do you tell when you believe you've encountered something that officially doesn't exist? Their first step is to contact Pease Air Force Base, the closest military installation to their home. If anyone would be interested in reports of unusual aircraft in New Hampshire airspace, surely it would be the Air Force. They place a phone call, speak briefly with an officer, and are told that their report will be noted and investigated if necessary. But this official response feels inadequate, given the magnitude of what they've experienced. They need someone who will take their account seriously, who will listen to the details, who might be able to help them understand what happened during those missing hours on the mountain highway. That someone turns out to be Walter Webb, an investigator with NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Webb is a serious researcher, a former astronomer who approaches UFO reports with scientific rigor rather than sensationalism. When he meets with the Hills in October 1961, just a few weeks after their encounter, he conducts what may be the most thorough interview in the early history of UFO investigation. For over 6 hours, Webb takes them through every detail of their experience, from the first sighting of the unusual light to their arrival home with the mysterious physical evidence. He asks probing questions, looks for inconsistencies, tests their memory for specific details. But rather than finding the hallmarks of hoaxers or delusional witnesses, he discovers two articulate, credible people struggling to understand an experience that has turned their quiet lives upside down. Webb's subsequent report will become a landmark document in UFO research, a detailed, objective account that treats the Hills experience with the seriousness it deserves while acknowledging the profound implications of what they claim to have witnessed. But even this validation doesn't provide the answers Betty and Barney desperately need. The nightmares continue, the anxiety persists, and the nagging sense that their memories are incomplete grows stronger with each passing day. It will be nearly 3 years before they find the help they need to unlock the full scope of what happened to them on that September night. And when those memories finally surface, they will reveal details so specific, so unusual, and so consistent between two separate witnesses that they will reshape the entire conversation about the possibility of contact between humans and non-human intelligence. Chapter 6. The Weight of the Unknown. As autumn gives way to winter in 1961 and winter melts into the spring of 1962, the Hills find themselves trapped in a peculiar kind of limbo. They have Walter Webb's detailed report, which validates their experience and treats them as credible witnesses. They have the physical evidence that continues to defy explanation, but they still don't have answers to the questions that haunt their quiet moments. What happened during those 2 missing hours? The question follows them through their daily routines like a persistent shadow. Betty will be helping a client at work and suddenly find herself staring out the window, wondering if those fragments of memory, the bright lights, the clinical examinations, are real or imagined. Barney will be sorting mail at the post office and catch himself, touching his forehead, remembering the sensation of those large, compelling eyes boring into his consciousness. Their sleep becomes increasingly troubled. Betty's dreams continue sporadically, but now they're joined by Barney's nightmares. Fragmented visions of being unable to move, of bright lights overhead, of voices speaking in tones he can't quite understand. Both of them begin to suffer from chronic anxiety, a persistent feeling of unease that seems to have no obvious cause. Their friends and family notice the change. Betty, normally outgoing and sociable, becomes more withdrawn, more hesitant to discuss her thoughts and feelings. Barney, always reliable and steady, seems distracted, jumpy at unexpected sounds, prone to moments of distant contemplation that worry those who know him well. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of their situation is the isolation it creates. How do you explain to friends over dinner that you believe you were taken aboard a spacecraft? How do you tell your colleagues that you've experienced something that challenges the fundamental assumptions of what's possible in the world? The Hills find themselves increasingly alone with their secret, carrying a burden that grows heavier with each passing month. By early 1963, nearly 2 years after their encounter, the strain is beginning to take a serious toll on their marriage. They love each other deeply, but the shared trauma of their experience, combined with the uncertainty about what it means, creates tensions they've never had to navigate before. They find themselves snapping at each other over minor issues, struggling to communicate about feelings they don't fully understand themselves. The breaking point comes during a particularly difficult period in the spring of 1963. Betty is having nightmares almost nightly now, waking up in terror with visions of medical instruments and bright lights. Barney is experiencing severe anxiety attacks, moments when his heart races, and he feels an overwhelming sense of panic for no apparent reason. Their doctor prescribes mild sedatives, but the medication does little to address the underlying psychological distress. It's Betty who finally suggests they might need professional help. Not because she doubts the reality of their experience, but because she recognizes they need someone trained to help them process trauma, someone who might be able to help them understand why their memories of that night remain so frustratingly incomplete. Their family physician refers them to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist in Boston who specializes in treating trauma, particularly among World War II veterans. Dr. Simon has extensive experience with hypnotherapy, using it to help patients recover from severe psychological wounds. He's respected in his field, known for his careful, methodical approach to treatment. When the Hills first meet Dr. Simon in December 1963, more than 2 years after their encounter, they're not entirely sure what they hope to accomplish. They tell him about the missing time, the physical evidence, the persistent anxiety, and nightmares. But they're careful not to mention their suspicions about what might have happened during those lost hours. They want to see what, if anything, hypnosis might reveal without leading or influencing the process. Dr. Simon listens to their account with the professional detachment of someone accustomed to hearing stories of human trauma. He doesn't dismiss their experience, but he also doesn't embrace it uncritically. His primary concern is their psychological well-being, helping them find relief from the anxiety and sleep disturbances that have been plaguing them for over 2 years. He explains that hypnosis might help them recover more complete memories of that night, which could potentially reduce their anxiety by filling in the troubling gaps in their recollection. But he warns them that the process might also reveal disturbing memories, and that they need to be prepared for whatever emerges. What Dr. Simon doesn't tell them, because he doesn't yet know it himself, is that the sessions they're about to begin will produce some of the most detailed, consistent, and extraordinary testimony in the history of psychological research. The memories that emerge under hypnosis will be so specific, so unusual, and so remarkably similar between two separate witnesses that they will challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of memory, trauma, and human experience. Chapter 7: Unlocking the Hidden Hours. Dr. Benjamin Simon's office in Boston is a calm, professional space designed to put patients at ease. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and an atmosphere of quiet confidentiality create the perfect environment for the difficult work of psychological healing. It's here, beginning in early 1964, that Betty and Barney Hill will finally confront the full scope of what happened to them on that September night in 1961. Dr. Simon's approach is methodical and careful. He conducts separate sessions with Betty and Barney, instructing them not to discuss their hypnotic experiences with each other between appointments. This protocol is designed to prevent cross-contamination of their memories, ensuring that whatever emerges from their subconscious minds is as pure and uninfluenced as possible. The early sessions focus on relaxation and establishing trust. Dr. Simon guides each of them through the basics of hypnotic induction, helping them reach the deep, relaxed state necessary for memory recovery. He asks general questions about their lives, their relationship, their experiences leading up to that September night. Gradually, session by session, he begins to approach the mystery of their missing time. Barney goes first. Under hypnosis, his memories of that night become remarkably clear and detailed. He describes the initial sighting of the light, the stops to observe it through binoculars, his terrifying walk toward the craft near Indian Head. But then, as Dr. Simon gently guides him past the point where his conscious memories end, something extraordinary begins to emerge. Barney describes a roadblock. Not the craft hovering overhead, but figures standing in the road blocking their path forward. The car comes to a stop, and these beings, small gray-skinned humanoids with large dark eyes, approach the vehicle. Barney tries to resist, but finds himself unable to move, unable to even speak clearly to Betty. The beings escort them from the car. Barney walks in a trance-like state, his feet barely touching the ground, guided by creatures that seem to communicate without speaking aloud. They're led to the craft, which sits silently in a clearing just off the highway, and taken inside through what appears to be a ramp or doorway. The interior of the craft is unlike anything in Barney's experience. Curved walls, soft lighting, and a series of rooms connected by narrow corridors. He's separated from Betty and taken to what can only be described as an examination room. A space with a raised table in the center and various instruments mounted on the walls and ceiling. Under Dr. Simon's careful questioning, Barney describes the examination in clinical detail. The beings are professional but impersonal, conducting what appears to be a comprehensive medical assessment. They examine his skin, his eyes, his mouth, and throat. They take samples of his hair and fingernails. Most memorably and disturbingly, they perform what seems to be a reproductive examination, collecting what Barney describes as a sperm sample using some kind of device. Throughout the examination, Barney is conscious, but unable to resist. The beings communicate through a combination of simple gestures and what he can only describe as mental impressions, thoughts and instructions that appear directly in his mind without being spoken aloud. The examination is thorough but not cruel. The beings seem genuinely curious about human anatomy and physiology, studying Barney's responses to various tests and procedures with what appears to be scientific interest rather than malicious intent. When the examination is complete, Barney is reunited with Betty and they're escorted back to their car. The last thing he remembers clearly is the sound of that rhythmic beeping they heard during their conscious drive home. But now, he understands it wasn't coming from their car. It was some kind of device placed on or near the vehicle, perhaps to monitor their departure from the encounter site. Dr. Simon records every word of Barney's account, taking careful notes and asking clarifying questions when the narrative becomes unclear. What emerges is not the confused ramblings of a delusional patient, but a remarkably coherent, detailed description of an experience that challenges every assumption about what's possible in the world. But Dr. Simon knows that one detailed account, no matter how convincing, proves nothing. The real test will come when he puts Betty under hypnosis and sees whether her recovered memories corroborate Barney's extraordinary claims. Chapter 8. Betty's Journey to the Stars. When Betty Hill finally undergoes hypnosis several sessions later, Dr. Simon has no idea what to expect. Will her memories match Barney's account? Will they contradict it? Or will she reveal something entirely different, confirming his suspicion that their shared trauma has created elaborate false memories? What emerges under hypnosis is both remarkably similar to Barney's account and uniquely Betty's own experience. Like Barney, she remembers the roadblock, the approach of the small gray beings, the trance-like walk to the craft. She describes the same curved interior spaces, the same soft lighting, the same atmosphere of clinical professionalism among her captors. But Betty's examination takes a different course, and her interactions with the beings are far more extensive. Betty is taken to a room similar to the one Barney described, but her examination includes a procedure that will become one of the most controversial and frequently discussed elements of the entire case. She describes a long, thin needle being inserted into her navel. What the examining being describes as a pregnancy test, though the procedure bears no resemblance to any medical technique known in 1961. The needle causes intense pain, and Betty cries out in distress. At this point, what she describes as the leader of the beings intervenes. This individual, slightly taller than the others and apparently in a position of authority, passes his hand over Betty's forehead, and the pain immediately subsides. This leader appears to be more communicative and empathetic than the other beings, showing something that might be interpreted as concern for Betty's well-being. But it's what happens after the examination that makes Betty's account truly extraordinary. The leader, perhaps recognizing Betty's intelligence and curiosity, engages her in what can only be described as a conversation, using a combination of broken English and mental impressions. He answers some of her questions about who they are and where they come from. When Betty asks about their origin, the leader shows her something that will become one of the most famous elements of the entire case, a three-dimensional star map. The map appears on what Betty describes as a wall or screen, showing a network of stars connected by various types of lines. The leader explains that the thick, solid lines represent regular trade routes, paths frequently traveled between different star systems. The broken or thinner lines represent expeditions or exploratory journeys to systems visited less frequently. When Betty asks which star represents Earth, the leader responds that if she doesn't know where she is on the map, there's no point in showing her where they're from. It's a logical response, but one that leaves Betty frustrated. She studies the map carefully, trying to memorize its details, sensing that this information might somehow be important. The leader also shows her a book with symbols she doesn't recognize, though the material feels unusual to the touch. When Betty asks if she can keep it as proof of her experience, the leader initially agrees. But after conferring with the other beings, he changes his mind, explaining that it would be better if she didn't remember the encounter at all. This comment proves to be prophetic. As Betty's examination and conversation with the leader conclude, she senses that something is being done to her memory, some kind of procedure designed to make her forget what has happened. The last clear memory from inside the craft is of the leader telling her that they will not be harmed, but that it would be better for everyone if they didn't remember their visit. Like Barney, Betty is eventually escorted back to the car where they're reunited for the drive home. The rhythmic beeping sounds they remember from their conscious experience were indeed some kind of monitoring device, confirming that their departure from the encounter site was observed and tracked. Dr. Simon finds himself in an unprecedented situation. Two separate witnesses, hypnotized independently with no opportunity to coordinate their stories, have provided remarkably consistent accounts of an experience that challenges the very foundations of consensus reality. The details they've provided are specific, unusual, and consistent between both accounts in ways that seem to rule out either delusion or deliberate fabrication. Chapter 9. The Map That Points to the Stars. Among all the extraordinary details that emerge from the Hill's hypnosis sessions, perhaps none captures the public imagination quite like Betty's star map. When she attempts to draw what she remembers from her conversation with the leader, the result is a network of stars connected by lines of varying thickness, a cosmic roadmap that seems to suggest organized travel between distant worlds. The drawing itself is relatively simple, 15 or so stars of varying sizes, connected by a web of lines. Some lines are thick and prominent, others thin and delicate, representing the difference between major trade routes and occasional expeditions, according to Betty's recollection of the leader's explanation. For several years after the Hill's case becomes public, the star map remains an intriguing but unverifiable piece of evidence. Astronomers point out that stellar positions visible from Earth don't necessarily match the relationships between stars in space, making any attempt to identify the pattern extremely difficult. The map appears to show stellar relationships from a perspective that wouldn't be available to anyone on Earth's surface. But in 1968, nearly a decade after the Hill's encounter, a fish culturist and amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish becomes fascinated by Betty's drawing. Fish has access to detailed star catalogs and begins the painstaking process of creating three-dimensional models of nearby star systems, using beads and string to represent stellar positions and relationships. Working with star catalogs available in the late 1960s, Fish constructs numerous models, examining them from different perspectives, looking for a viewpoint that might match Betty's remembered star map. After months of careful work, she believes she's found a match, a view of nearby star systems as they would appear from the vicinity of Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system approximately 39 light-years from Earth. From this perspective, Fish argues, the major stars in Betty's map correspond to well-known stellar neighbors of Earth: Sol, our Sun, Alpha Centauri, Tau, Ceti, and several others. The thick lines in Betty's drawing connect stars that, according to Fish's interpretation, would be logical destinations for interstellar travelers, systems with stable, long-lived stars that might harbor habitable planets. Fish's work generates considerable excitement among UFO researchers and even attracts attention from some professional astronomers. Here, seemingly, is objective evidence that Betty Hill's recovered memories contain information she couldn't have known in 1961, information about stellar relationships only available through sophisticated astronomical catalogs and three-dimensional modeling. But the star map controversy also highlights the challenges inherent in the Hill's case. Skeptical astronomers point out numerous problems with Fish's analysis. The star catalogs available in the 1960s were incomplete, particularly regarding the faint stars that would need to be included to make Fish's model work. The perspective required to see Betty's pattern assumes a very specific viewpoint in space, with no clear reason why that particular location would be significant. More problematically, as more complete star catalogs become available in the 1970s and 1980s, Fish's proposed match becomes less convincing. Stars that weren't known to exist in the 1960s, but which would be visible from the Zeta Reticuli perspective, don't appear in Betty's drawing. The correspondence that seemed so compelling in 1968 begins to look increasingly like a case of finding patterns in random data. Yet the star map remains one of the most discussed aspects of the Hills case. Even skeptics acknowledge that Betty's drawing contains an unusual level of detail for something that supposedly emerged from her subconscious mind under hypnosis. The fact that it shows stellar relationships from a three-dimensional perspective rather than the two-dimensional view we see from Earth suggests either an extraordinary feat of imagination or access to information not readily available to most people in 1961. Dr. Simon, observing the growing fascination with the star map and other details from his patients' hypnosis sessions, finds himself increasingly concerned about the direction the case is taking. His primary goal was always therapeutic, helping Betty and Barney process their trauma and find relief from their symptoms. The growing public attention and debate about the reality of their recovered memories was never part of his treatment plan. Chapter 10: The Aftermath of Memory. By 1965, nearly 4 years after their encounter and 2 years after beginning hypnosis with Dr. Simon, Betty and Barney Hill find their lives transformed in ways they never anticipated. The therapeutic goal of their sessions, finding relief from anxiety and sleep disturbances, has been largely achieved. The missing hours of September 19, 1961 are missing no longer. They have detailed, consistent memories of an experience that, whether real or imagined, now feels complete and integrated into their understanding of that night. But completeness brings its own challenges. Having recovered memories of being taken aboard an extraterrestrial spacecraft, of being examined by non-human beings, of conversations with entities from another star system, Betty and Barney must now live with the full weight of what they believe happened to them. The simple mystery of missing time has been replaced by the complex reality of an experience that challenges everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the universe. Dr. Simon, reviewing his extensive notes from their sessions, find himself in an unusual position for a medical professional. He has 2 patients who have recovered detailed memories of an event that, by any conventional understanding of reality, cannot have occurred as they describe it. Yet, the therapeutic benefit of the memory recovery is undeniable. Both Betty and Barney show significant improvement in their anxiety levels and sleep patterns after completing their hypnosis sessions. From a clinical perspective, Dr. Simon develops what becomes his official interpretation of the case, that the abduction narrative represents a shared fantasy that allowed the Hills to process and resolve the psychological trauma of their encounter with an unidentified flying object. In this view, the detailed memories recovered under hypnosis are real as psychological experiences, but not necessarily accurate as historical events. This interpretation allows Dr. Simon to acknowledge the therapeutic value of the recovered memories while maintaining his position as a respected member of the medical community. He doesn't need to endorse the reality of extraterrestrial visitation to recognize that his patients have genuinely benefited from the treatment process. But this careful professional stance becomes more difficult to maintain when the Hills case explodes into public consciousness. In 1965, reporter John Luttrell of the Boston Traveler learns about the case and publishes the first newspaper account of the Hills claims. The story is picked up by other newspapers, and suddenly Betty and Barney find themselves at the center of a media firestorm they never sought. The Hills, remember, were reluctant witnesses from the beginning. They reported their initial sighting quietly to authorities, sought help from NICAP, only when they needed someone to listen to their story, and entered therapy with Dr. Simon simply to find relief from psychological distress. They never sought publicity, never tried to profit from their experience, and never positioned themselves as spokespersons for the reality of UFO encounters. Now suddenly, they're being contacted by reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers from around the world. Their case is being debated in newspapers, analyzed by scientists, and discussed in living rooms across America. They've become public figures in a conversation they never intended to join. The media attention brings both support and skepticism. Some people view them as brave witnesses willing to speak truth about humanity's contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Others see them as delusional individuals whose fantasies have been amplified by irresponsible sensationalism. The Hills find themselves caught in the middle, trying to maintain their privacy and dignity while their most personal and traumatic memories are dissected in public forums. In 1966, writer John G. Fuller publishes The Interrupted Journey, a detailed book about the Hills' experience that includes extensive excerpts from their hypnosis sessions. The book becomes a bestseller, introducing millions of readers to the details of their case and cementing their position as the archetypal abduction witnesses. Fuller's book also establishes many of the narrative elements that will become standard in later abduction accounts. The missing time, the small gray beings with large eyes, the clinical medical examinations, the star map indicating extraterrestrial origins. Whether these elements represent genuine memories of contact with non-human intelligence or powerful psychological constructs that have influenced subsequent witnesses, the Hills case provides the template that shapes the modern alien abduction phenomenon. Chapter 11. The Legacy of a September Night. As the 1960s draw to a close, Betty and Barney Hill find themselves in the unique position of being the world's first widely publicized alien abduction witnesses. Their experience, documented through careful investigation and detailed hypnosis sessions, has established the basic narrative framework that will influence countless similar accounts in the decades to follow. But fame, even accidental fame, comes with costs they never anticipated. Barney, already dealing with the health problems that come with middle age and the stress of their extraordinary experience, begins to suffer from more serious medical issues. The publicity surrounding their case, combined with the skepticism and ridicule they sometimes face, takes a toll on his physical and emotional well-being. In 1969, at the age of 46, Barney suffers a stroke and dies, leaving Betty to carry on alone as the keeper of their shared secret. Betty continues to speak occasionally about their experience, participating in conferences and interviews when she feels it might be helpful to other people who've had similar encounters. But she's always careful to emphasize that she and Barney never sought to convince anyone of anything. They simply reported what they experienced and underwent therapy to help them process their memories. Over the years, their case is subjected to every form of analysis imaginable. Astronomers examine Betty's star map, looking for correlations with known stellar positions. Psychologists debate the reliability of memories recovered under hypnosis. Investigators analyze the physical evidence, looking for proof of the unusual marks on their car and the strange powder on Betty's dress. Some researchers become convinced that the Hills encountered genuine extraterrestrial visitors, and that their recovered memories represent humanity's first documented contact with non-human intelligence. Others argue that their experience, while subjectively real, can be explained through conventional psychological and sociological factors: stress, suggestion, cultural influence, and the creative power of the human mind under hypnosis. The debate continues to this day, more than 60 years after that September night in the White Mountains. New researchers periodically examine the case with fresh perspectives and modern analytical tools. Skeptics continue to propose alternative explanations for the Hills' experience. Believers continue to argue that their account contains details and consistencies that can't be easily explained through conventional means. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Betty and Barney Hill isn't found in the endless debates about the reality of their experience. Perhaps it's found in the courage they demonstrated in speaking truthfully about something they knew would subject them to ridicule and disbelief. Two people faced with an impossible experience made the difficult choice to seek help, to undergo rigorous investigation, and ultimately to share their story with the world when circumstances beyond their control brought it to public attention. They endured skepticism, media attention, and personal cost to maintain their position that something extraordinary happened to them on a quiet September night in 1961. Whether that something was contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, an elaborate psychological construction created to process trauma, or some other explanation we haven't yet considered, Betty and Barney Hill showed us how ordinary people can respond to extraordinary circumstances with dignity, honesty, and courage. Their case remains one of the most thoroughly documented, carefully investigated, and enduringly mysterious encounters in the history of UFO research. The physical evidence they reported, the memories they recovered, and the consistency of their separate accounts continue to challenge easy explanations 6 decades later. And on quiet September nights, when the stars glitter in the deep velvet sky above New Hampshire's White Mountains, travelers on those winding mountain highways sometimes find themselves glancing up at the darkness, wondering what might be watching from the spaces between the stars, and whether two ordinary people really did encounter something extraordinary on a night very much like this one. As we near the end of our journey through Betty and Barney Hill's extraordinary experience, it's important to acknowledge that their case has never achieved universal acceptance. For more than 6 decades, researchers, scientists, and curious observers have divided into 2 camps, each offering compelling but fundamentally incompatible explanations for what happened on that September night. Let's explore both perspectives with the care and respect they deserve, because the truth, whatever it might be, lies somewhere in the intersection of evidence, experience, and human understanding. The believer's case. Those who accept the Hills' account as genuine extraterrestrial contact point to several compelling factors that seem to resist conventional explanation. First, there's the remarkable consistency between Betty and Barney's separate hypnosis sessions. Dr. Simon took extraordinary care to prevent cross-contamination between their accounts, conducting individual sessions and instructing them not to discuss their recovered memories with each other. Yet, their descriptions of the craft's interior, the being's appearance, and the sequence of examinations align in ways that seem unlikely if they were simply creating fantasy narratives. The level of specific detail in their accounts also impresses believers. Betty's description of the medical instruments, the texture of the being's skin, the layout of the examination rooms, these aren't vague, dreamlike impressions, but precise, consistent descriptions that remained stable across multiple hypnosis sessions. Barney's account of the reproductive examination, uncomfortable though it was to discuss, includes technical details that seem remarkably specific for a fantasy construction. Then there's the physical evidence that the Hills discovered immediately after their encounter, before they had time to construct elaborate false memories. The circular spots on their car that deflected compass needles, the torn clothing, the mysterious powder on Betty's dress, the permanently stopped watches, all discovered within hours of their experience, documented by Walter Webb's careful investigation, and never adequately explained by skeptical researchers. Believers also point to Betty's star map as potentially containing information she couldn't have known in 1961. While Marjorie Fish's analysis has been criticized, the basic fact remains. Betty drew a 3-dimensional stellar arrangement from her recovered memories, showing relationships between stars that wouldn't be visible from Earth's perspective. Whether or not it matches any specific star pattern, the drawing demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of stellar geometry that seems unusual for someone creating a fantasy. Perhaps most importantly, believers emphasize the Hills' credibility and motivation, or rather, their lack of motivation for fabrication. They never sought publicity, never tried to profit from their experience, and initially reported it only to authorities and a small circle of investigators. They underwent rigorous psychological examination, submitted to extensive questioning, and endured public scrutiny they never wanted. What possible benefit would justify maintaining an elaborate hoax for decades? The skeptic's response. Skeptical researchers offer a very different interpretation of the same evidence, arguing that the Hills' experience can be understood through well-documented psychological and sociological phenomena. They begin with the initial sighting, noting that the Hills were driving at night through an area where bright stars and planets would be clearly visible. Jupiter was particularly prominent in the sky that evening, and several researchers have argued that the following light could have been a misidentification of this bright planet, which would indeed appear to maintain a consistent position relative to a moving car over long distances. The close encounter at Indian Head, skeptics suggest, represents an escalation of this initial misperception, possibly combined with fatigue-induced hallucination. After hours of night driving, following a stressful vacation and dealing with the social pressures of an interracial marriage, in 1961, America, the Hills, were psychologically primed for unusual experiences. The missing time, in this view, could be explained by a combination of factors. Disorientation following their frightening encounter with what they believed was a UFO. Possible micro-sleep episodes during the drive home, and the natural tendency of traumatized individuals to have fragmented memories of stressful events. Most importantly, skeptics argue that the detailed abduction memories recovered under hypnosis represent confabulation rather than genuine recall. They point to extensive research showing that hypnosis can create false memories that feel completely real to the subject. The consistency between Betty and Barney's accounts, rather than proving their accuracy, could reflect the influence of Betty's earlier dreams, which both of them knew about before beginning hypnosis. Skeptics also note cultural factors that could have influenced the Hills' recovered memories. Science fiction films and television shows of the era, including the Outer Limits episode The Bolero Shield, which featured beings with wraparound eyes, provided a ready-made vocabulary of images and concepts that could have unconsciously shaped their hypnotic narratives. The physical evidence, skeptics argue, has alternative explanations that were never adequately explored. The compass deflection could have resulted from ordinary magnetic anomalies in the car's metal. The torn clothing and scuffed shoes could have occurred during their stops to observe the light, when they were walking on rough ground in darkness. The stopped watches could have been damaged by any number of mundane causes during their trip. As for Betty's star map, skeptics point out that Marjorie Fish's analysis was based on incomplete stellar catalogs and required very specific assumptions about perspective and stellar selection. As more complete astronomical data became available, the apparent match to Zeta Reticuli became less convincing. The map, they argue, represents either the product of Betty's imagination or a case of humans finding patterns in random data. The questions that remain. Both believers and skeptics must grapple with questions that don't have easy answers. If the Hills' experience was a misidentification and fantasy, how do we explain the immediate physical evidence they discovered? Why did their watches stop? What caused the compass deflection? What was the source of the powder on Betty's dress? But if their experience was genuine extraterrestrial contact, why hasn't similar physical evidence been preserved in other cases? Why don't we have more definitive proof of such an extraordinary event? How do we account for the apparent influence of contemporary science fiction on their recovered memories? The Hills themselves, it's worth noting, never claimed to have all the answers. They simply reported what they experienced, sought help when they needed it, and tried to live normal lives despite the extraordinary circumstances they believed they had encountered. Betty Hill, who lived until 2004 and occasionally spoke about her experience in later years, always maintained that she and Barney had simply told the truth about what happened to them. She didn't ask anyone to believe their account, but she never wavered from her position that something extraordinary had occurred on that September night in 1961. The enduring mystery. Perhaps the most honest assessment of the Hills case is that it remains genuinely mysterious. 6 decades of investigation, analysis, and debate have not produced a definitive explanation that satisfies all observers and accounts for all the evidence. The case sits at the intersection of human psychology, social dynamics, physical evidence, and our understanding of what's possible in the universe. It challenges us to consider questions that go beyond the specifics of one couple's experience. How do we evaluate extraordinary claims? What constitutes sufficient evidence for extraordinary events? How do we balance skeptical inquiry with respect for human experience? The Hills case endures, not because it provides clear answers, but because it raises profound questions about the nature of reality, memory, and our place in the cosmos. Whether their experience represents genuine contact with non-human intelligence, an elaborate psychological construction, or something else entirely, it continues to challenge our assumptions about what we know and what we might yet discover. And perhaps that's the most appropriate legacy for Betty and Barney Hill. Not as definitive proof of extraterrestrial visitation, nor as a cautionary tale about the dangers of false memory, but as a reminder that the universe still holds mysteries that humble our certainty and inspire our curiosity. The mystery endures. The questions remain. And somewhere in the vast cosmos that surrounds our small, blue world, the truth waits patiently to be discovered.